Flashback.
I need Flask project tutorial on PotterTube.
They ask you how you are, you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine, but you just can't get into it because they would never understand.
One eternity later.
Alright. Wait. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe to this channel. We need to make our headmaster sleep better. He hasn't been catching enough sleep from all the views. Alright, let's start by creating a separate folder for the project on our desktop. I'm naming it Harry Potter API because why not? Now, open this folder in your preferred code editor. In my case, it's near Vim. Next, create another directory inside this folder and name it app for proper structuring of our application. Inside the app directory, create a Python file and name it init_py. We will write all the code to start the app here. Before we continue, we need to check if Python is installed so we can install the necessary packages. Open the terminal and type pip, then press enter. If you see any errors, make sure you have Python installed correctly. Now, install the Flask framework with the command pip install Flask. Alright, it's successfully installed. Now we are ready to start actual coding. Let's begin by importing the Flask dependency that we just downloaded. Type from Flask import Flask. Now, create a variable called app and assign it Flask with the argument name. Let's dive into the Flask package. After examining the Flask package, we can see that Flask is a class which requires our application context as its constructor. This makes our app variable an object. To run this Python file, type app.run and specify the port number of your choice. For me, it's 4040. Before we run this file, let's add a bit of code. We'll create a simple hello world program in Flask. Type @app.root with the argument / and pass get as a named argument in the methods list. Directly below this, define a function as you would in Python and make it return hello world. That's it. We are ready to run the program. Open the terminal and don't forget to change directory into the app directory since our program is located there. Type python init.py to run the file. After running the command, click on the link that's generated, which includes our IP address. Open that link in your browser. Voila. We should see hello world printed on the page. Let me zoom in for you. Note that this exposes our IP address. As an alternative, we can use localhost followed by the port number. It will produce the same result. There you go. We've completed our simple hello world application in Python. Now, let's look at our code. We created a root for /. If we add a / at the end of the URL, we still get the same result. This means that / is the default root for any API. Now, let's look at some other complex examples. Let's look at how we can do dynamic routing. First, we'll just copy the above function and change it a little. We'll give it a root of / followed by left and right angular braces inside of which we will take a variable name, and it is of type string. Let's also not forget to change the name of the function, and since we are taking a name from the root, we must also take the same variable in as a parameter in the function declaration. For simplicity, we will just print the name after hello by first converting the string to an F string. Now, if we just go to the browser and type / and enter anything and press enter, then we get an error that the requested URL is not found. This is because we have changed the code, but didn't rerun the application. We have to rerun in order for the changes to apply. Later, I will show you a workaround for this. Let's now go to the browser and try the same thing. Now we notice that the code is working properly. So if I go to the root /Kingray, it returns hello Kingray, and if I type anything, it returns that value. And don't forget we also have our default root which we haven't changed. For fun, let's just change it, and go to the browser and press reload. We can observe that the changes have not applied. In order for hot reloading, or for any change in our code, the app must be rerun. This is a tiring task, but in order to do so, we just have to pass another argument beside PORT equals 4040, that is, debug equals true. That's all I need to do. Now let's rerun our application for the last time and wait. This time we see that in our console, debug mode is now on. Now let's try to change our code, and as soon as you change the code, we can see that the application restarted automatically. Let's try this again. As you can see, it works again. Okay, now let's move this part to a different folder named config. Let's create another directory in the app directory. This folder will contain all the config related code. We will move our debugging property to this folder. Now, in this folder, I will create a config.py Python file in which I will just create a config class with a variable debug equals true. Please note that debug must be written in capital letters. Now we must update our main code which, as I have already told you, exists in init_py. So import that config from that location. Since we are inside the app directory, I also don't need the app dot. Now I will update the main code by using a method at .config from _object and passing it the config object we just imported. Let's simply rerun our application. We can see that debug mode is on. Let's test whether that works or not by renaming that to false and rerunning the application again. Now we see that debug mode is now off. So now we have successfully abstracted the config part of the code from our main file. Now we will build a simple API, aka Harry Potter API, using service pattern and blueprint architecture. Don't worry, I'll cover everything along the way. Let's start by building our file structure. Let's create a services folder, routes folder for routes, and finally, a models folder. In our models folder, let's create character.py Python file. Let's start by creating a class with the same name and we will call the init method to assign it some fields. As you might already know, the first argument is always self. Now our character model will contain fields like ID, name, role, and actor name. Now we have created our model. Let's add a simple data structure. To store our data you can also use SQL for data storage. For simplicity, architecture, service patterns, and best practices explanation, I will use the simplest data structure that is lists. Let's create a character list containing some characters. But wait, the IntelliSense is telling that I can take any type as an input for the argument ID. The same goes for the name, role, and actor name. None simply denotes that it returns nothing. In order to get the proper data types, we will use static typing which exists by default in Python yet no one uses it. All we have to do is go to the variable or parameter variable and add a colon and type the data type. I'll repeat this for all our fields. Now if we see this, we get proper IntelliSense, so any user trying to add a character can see what type of data they must input. Let's quickly add some dummy data. We know that Harry Potter is played by Daniel Radcliffe and Hermione is played by beautiful Emma Watson. For now, these would suffice. Let's check whether this works by creating another route in our main file. We will give it a route of /characters and the method can be get as well. Let's now use list comprehensions to quickly loop over the dummy list of characters we just created and convert each character to a dictionary, which exists in key value pairs using the vars function. Let me quickly import the characters dummy list coming from our models folder inside character Python file. Now we simply run our application. Now if we go to the characters root, which is /characters, we can see that we are getting our dummy data. You may see this differently according to your browser, but I'm using an extension to make it look pretty. Now adding more and more roots will increase the number of lines of our code in the main file and make our code definitely not scalable and maintainable. So in order to maintain scalability, architectural patterns and design patterns come into play. Now let's look at how we can make this scalable. Let's remove this code and create another Python file, but this time inside our services. As I said, we will follow the service pattern. Inside this Python file, I will import the dummy characters as I did in the main file, and create a character service class which will contain all the services in the form of methods. Let's quickly create a function to display all the characters. As you have guessed, it's the same freaking code, but a bit more readable this time. Let's create an object in this class as well to easily import that. And now we will create our final Python file character_root.py inside the roots folder. In this, we will import something called blueprint. Now what's this function? Don't worry, everything will make sense in a minute. Now, in this file, we will first initialize the blueprint class we just imported. This takes in 3 arguments at minimum. The first is a unique name, the second is our application context, which is name, and lastly, we will pass URL prefix equals /API/characters to follow REST API guidelines. Now, similar to how we've been creating roots, we will use this blueprint object we just created. We've just created another method and gave it the default root. Before we return, let's create a character_service object as well, but first, we need to import it. So here I'm importing the character service class and creating an object of it. Looks like I have a typo here, let me fix it. I'll now call the method we created in the character service, which is get_all_characters. But hey, looks like I've already created an instance of this character service class. I can simply import that and remove the unnecessary object. It may look like we've created a blueprint for the characters, but we haven't integrated it into our main file. So, let's do that by typing app.register_blueprint and giving it the object of the blueprint from the roots directory. Don't forget to import it from our roots directory. Let's run this file again. Let's run it by first cd into the directory and then typing Python followed by the file we want to run. Now, if I go to the characters root, we can see that characters are printed, which are located here. To access this root, we have the default root of / and a URL prefix of /API/characters. Hence, here we type /API/characters, and as expected, we got the data. In the character services class, let's define all the functions we are going to perform in this project, which are filtering a character by ID. Here ID is required. Creating a character, here name, role and actor name are required, same goes for updating, and finally deleting a character requires as ID. First, let's implement filtering a character by ID. I'll loop over all the dummy characters, and if the character ID matches the ID passed, we can simply return that character by converting it to a dictionary. Now, we'll define a root for this service using a dynamic root that takes an ID as a parameter, which is of type int, and its method is get. We'll give it the same name, and take the ID in its argument, then call the service responsible for filtering by ID. We'll pass the ID from the root to this method as we need it to check our dummy data. Let's test if this works. We have two characters with IDs 1 and 2. Let's add 2 at the end of our URL and press enter. Oh, look, we get the data related to that particular ID. Let's also try with ID 1, and as expected, that works. If I go back to /characters, we get all the data from our dummy list. Now, we'll implement the logic needed to create a new character. So, we will first create an ID for the new character, because we need to dynamically add the ID when creating a new character. We don't want the user to provide the ID as it leads to many issues. So, we'll make use of the maximum function in Python by looping over all the character IDs in the dummy character list and adding one to it for obvious reasons. We will now create a new character just like how we created in the dummy data. We'll pass the new ID and other respective fields as well. To add a new entry to the simplest data structure, a list, we'll simply append this new character to it, and finally return that new character. Now let's quickly define a root for this in the roots section. I'll simply copy paste one of the functions written here and change the function name to create_character. I'll now call the method create_character using our service object, and we can see that we require the following fields. To create a character, we need to use something called a post request, where we send data that is not usually visible. So, we write post in the methods list and the root can be the same. Now we will get the data from the request using request from the Flask library and calling the get_json method, which will give us the data. Okay, now let's destructure all the fields that we need. Name equals data, name, and role equals data role. I'm just getting the values based on their keys. We can also do this by data point get, actor_name, both syntaxes work, and we simply pass those metadata. Now let's try to run this project. We'll first go to our default root. Not to mention, we have to find a URL prefix, so that becomes the default root. Now let's also check whether our filtering works or not. Okay, that seems to work. Now, how do I send the data using the post method? We will need the help of Postman to test requests other than get. So here, I will simply paste in our URL from the browser and send the request. We get the same details. Okay, so let's now check the filtering by giving it an existing ID, and it works. Now let's look at the create_character endpoint or root. We will create a character with the same root as displaying all characters, which is the default root. Don't forget to change the request to post, as you can see beside my URL. Here we send the data by clicking on the body and choosing raw. But if that fails to work, go to the header tab and add these to say that we will send data in JSON format. For me, it works without that, so I'm simply removing it. We give the data this way. I'll click on the send button, and as we can see, the new character is created with a dynamic ID. If that, for some reason, didn't work for you, go to the header and type content type, application/json. That should work. We sent 2 requests, and created 2 new characters. We can check in Postman, we have 2 new characters with the given data. So, if I filter the new characters based on their ID, it should now work. Okay, now let's quickly work on the updating service. We start by looping over all the characters and checking if the ID matches that of the character ID. If it does, we will simply update the fields in the character name, role, and actor underscore name and return the updated character. Don't forget to convert it to a dictionary first. Now we will define a route for it. Since for updating, we need the ID from the parameter, we will use dynamic routing. So the route becomes slash followed by ID, and the method is also post as we are sending sensitive data. We define a function that takes ID as a parameter and checks whether the ID doesn't exist. We will return a JSON message saying that the ID is not given. Although this part of the code will never run, well, we can't say for sure. Try giving it an ID of 0 or -1. If the ID is given, we will simply get the data the same way, copying and pasting that, and calling the character underscore service point update underscore character method with the respective fields. Let's now check this. Let's check all the others as well. Before we check this, let's create a character, get the character, and then update it by giving it an ID and the respective field in the body. As you can see, we get an error saying method not allowed. Let's quickly jump to our code and see what's wrong. Okay, I see that we gave it a method of post. We actually need to give it a method of put. Now let's try all the functions again. Don't forget to change the method to put, just like I did, but my excuse is that I'm blind. Well, technically, I have glasses. Let's now send the request, and now it worked. Don't trust me, go and query all the characters again. Here we can see that we've actually updated the character. Let's try this again. Let's now send the request and it worked. Now let's change the first character and send the request, and we can once again observe that it worked. So, if you want to revert all the changes, simply stop the app and rerun it. As we are operating in a list and not a real database, a simple rerun of the app will restore its original changes. Use a proper database when you want to make a serious app. As you can see, I have a simple list here. Let's now finish this project by creating a service for deleting a character. We once again start by looping over all the characters, but this time we also need the index. So, we will use the enumerate function and pass it the characters. When the ID of the character matches that of the ID given, we simply want to delete that character present at that index. Let's return a message that the character is deleted in JSON format. Let's create a route with the same route as our update route, as we will delete a character based on the ID. For the method, we have something called delete, so we'll pick that one. As usual, we define a method that takes in an ID and returns the deleting service by passing it the ID. Let's test this again. I won't talk as it's the same freaking thing every time. So now let's actually send the request. As you can see, it's been deleted. Now let's query the data and we see the same output, no matter where we test. Let's add some characters, and get all characters. Also let's update, and delete this newly added character. There we go. It obviously worked because, who the F do you think wrote this? By the way, in order to revert back, simply rerun the application. So, we have successfully completed our basic CRUD operation Harry Potter characters API with service pattern and blueprint architecture. I know, long ass name. But now, let's add status codes and other non-crucial but important stuff, which is the status codes. When we successfully get the result, we want to show a status code of 200. We will do the same thing for all successful requests. Also, let's try to handle unexpected errors. When an ID is not present, we will return a message implying that the ID is required, and pass 400 as the status code. Also, when we create a new character, we need to pass a status code of 201. If you want to know more about these status codes, simply Google it yourself. I'm too lazy to explain elementary stuff. Let's also handle the case where there is no name, role, or actor underscore name. Then we will return name, role, and actor underscore name are required, and also pass a 400 status code. I'll simply copy this for the updating route. Let's repeat the same process for deleting as well. I'm lazy to speak, even though I'm using AI voice. We now have handled all the edge cases in the routing part. Let's try to handle the errors in our services class as well. Here, we won't return anything if the character is not found, right? So, let's just say that the ID doesn't exist. Let's also handle the case for updating when the ID mentioned doesn't exist. I'll simply use the same thing again for deleting the character. Okay, let's go over all the files we went through in this video. We have our config, our model, our routes, and our services. Finally, our main Python file, which is the entry point of our app. Alright students, plug in those headphones, and prepare to dive into the deep sleep with our grand finale.